I first started growing Patagonian plants back in the 80s and 90s, and first got my chance to visit Patagonia in 1997 on an RHS tour. But it wasn't until 2000 that I managed to get on one of the AGS tours run by Peter Erskine. And I went on several of these, and then we started visiting as a small group of usually 8 people, including Hilary Little, who was in the audience here. And I think since then, I've visited Patagonia about 15 or 16 times. So it took us a while to get used to the flora, to be able to identify it. And at the same time, we began to cultivate more and more species. But let's just... So this is Patagonia, southern part of South America, sometimes known as the Southern Cone, and it runs from roughly here down to here. It's formed by Argentina to the east. The boundary between Argentina and Chile runs along the Andes, more or less. There's a couple of ice fields, strong winds coming across carrying moisture, so generally fairly wet conditions on the Chilean side. And most of our visits have been on the Argentinian side, the dry mountains and the dry steppe, which is sort of semi-desert. To the east of the Falkland Islands, which has a sort of depauperate Patagonian flora. But the Falklands and South America have never been linked by a land bridge. So they've been colonized by, I guess, birds' feet and wind dispersed seed. And believe me, there are very strong winds in these areas. So what I want to do is look at cultivation and under various headings, and work through various groups of plants, as we'll see. But I guess the main problem with cultivation of these South American plants is getting seeds. And we were very lucky in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, because John Watson and Anita Flores produced a fantastic seed list every year. And later Jim Archibald produced a seed list also. And I think in some ways we thought this was going to continue forever. And when it all stopped, we were down to a few odd seed collections by people like Wojtek Hollerbeck and other East Europeans, and a firm called Chili Flora, who I wouldn't necessarily recommend, overpriced and fairly old seed usually. So at the moment, very few sources of seeds, and I think what we now get, we should hang on to, we should try and propagate. I'll look a little bit at cultivation methods for various groups. How to propagate them. It's really important once you get a species in cultivation now to propagate them by seed or vegetative means. Otherwise we lose them, and the chances of getting them back in cultivation is fairly remote. Once you have them with seed, it's always fantastic because you can select out forms that do well for you, good color forms, and you can even hybridize if you're that way inclined between different species. But whatever you do, I think once you have a plant in cultivation, it's important to ensure that you distribute it to other keen growers, which is what I've tended to do. And also, because I know that Aberconwy Nursery is fantastic at propagation, I've usually passed plants on to Aberconwy Nursery. So you can get probably more South American plants from there than anywhere else in the UK. The plants that we grow from Patagonia come from a wide range of habitats. I've listed some there, anything from mountains to semi-desert steppe. Some of them do better under cover. Ones that don't like being very wet are better in pot culture. but many will grow in raised beds, rookeries, and where they are suited woodland or waterside. Most of the composts I've used are based on loam. I mix by eye, but generally I use John Innes compost, probably JI2, and anything from, in some cases, no JI, just sand, grit, perlite, and a bit of leaf mold. But more often with anything up to 30%, 50% JI with sand, grit, and perlite added, and leaf mold. Peat I don't use now, but of course many of the JIs still have a bit of peat in them. I vary the compost depending on whether they're from open steppe, when I use a sandier compost, or a grittier compost for the plants from mountains, from high mountain ridges, and leaf mold where I want a bit more moisture in the soil. For seed sowing, I usually just use JI with sand or perlite mixed in and cover the seed with fine grit. So a fairly standard method. And this is what my seed would look like. I grow them mostly in 7 centimetre plastic pots, the sort of things you'd buy alpines in at nurseries. I usually sow seed in, for most species, in autumn, November, December, but for some species I may sow in spring, as we'll see. It's important to label your plants with name, date of sowing, and the source of the seed. And some seed will take years to germinate. Some, like the Rosulate violas, will germinate over several years. So you'll get several successive germinations in spring each year. And some plants germinate, or some seed germinates very rapidly. And the very rapid germinating seed I tend to sow in spring, so it's not sitting out over winter, subject to botrytis. So this is hopefully what you get. You can see this is from a few years ago, because we've got some metaldehyde slug pellets there, and slugs can be a problem. My seed pots are in a shade frame outside. They're not covered, they're open to the elements, and they get all the rain over winter. And I think this helps in germination. These look as though they're ready to pot on. And the species I want to look at that are in cultivation, there are more, but these are the ones I want to look at in this talk, including mainly dicots, but a few monocots, rhodophylla and tristegma. There are many more species that aren't in cultivation, but I think the chances of getting seed of these at the moment is quite remote. So I want to start by looking at Oxalis, and there's an article in the latest AGS bulletin on these 4 species. There's a fantastic genus a fantastic section within the Oxalidaceae, genus Oxalis, the palmatifoli, which have these palm-like leaves, and 4 species within this section all occur in Patagonia. And all of these can be grown. Perhaps Lauricata is the most difficult and probably hardly in cultivation in the UK, but the other 3 will succeed in troughs, raised beds, or under cover if necessary. So this is an example of one of these, this group of Oxalis, and 4 species, and each of the species is so incredibly variable. To give a picture of it, to represent the species, is very difficult because each is so variable. So the top left there, we've got Lauricata, which is a high mountain snowmelt species, very difficult in cultivation. Oxalis adenophylla, which is from central to northern Patagonia and beyond, found in mountains and steppe. So quite a wide elevation range and latitudinal range. The two other species, Laciniata and Eniaphila, are from the far south. Laciniata, anything from the coast up to usually staying in the steppe or elevated steppe, but some populations in the mountains. And Eniaphila also from the coast up to mountain tops. So these last three, Adenophila, Laciniata, and Eniaphila, are all growable. So look at some Laciniata. I said that these are quite variable, and you can see here, these are all the same species. They all have narrow leaves, often with undulated margins on the leaves. The best forms have always been collected in the south of Argentine Patagonia, and more specifically around one particular estancia, Estancia Stag River. And that's where many of these really fantastically colored forms are being collected. And they're growing in dry grassland, open steppe, amongst other plants. And in the wild, they often produce only a few flowers. They produce more flowers in cultivation. The top right one is the typical color form for southern Chile, sort of pinkish, not much variation. More Laciniatas. The top left one is a form with very hairy leaves, we'll see in a moment, from a mountain at the north of its range, Montes of Bajos. The bottom left one is from the Atlantic coast, so they get right out to the coast. And the other two are from about 800 meters on dry steppe in southern Patagonia. Here's the very hairy leafed one, variety pubescens, and I think this is still in cultivation. Adenophila I find the easiest, and again, very variable. Relatively few white ones. I mentioned on Facebook a few years ago that there was very few white ones, and everybody said, oh, there's lots. But in fact, what they were seeing in cultivation are Eniaphila rather than Adenophila. Varying so from white through to deep pink, and the bottom left one is a form from Paso Cordoba, which grows in sort of sparse scrub woodland and is ginormous. It's a large plant with these flowers with a large eye, and in cultivation it remains large, and there are one or two forms going around of this eyed Adenophila. Leaf color varies quite a lot in Adenophila. Some are marked with purple and others are, for some populations, no markings at all. But a fantastic plant, well worth growing, and when worth crossing forms if you have them, and really generating new clones. There are quite a few. They're very promiscuous, these 4 species, and if you grow them together, they will produce hybrids. And these are examples of hybrids between Adenophila and Laciniata. If you leave the bees to do their work, you'll get hybrids. If you want to do it yourself and select the parents, so much the better. Come on. Sorry, it's just having a bit of a... Are we all... Can you hear me still? Yeah. Oh, come on.
If PowerPoint crashed, it might be worth restarting it and restarting it again.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're still there, Zoom is fine. Zoom is...
Yeah.
Okay.
Will it go backward, Martin?
No.
No. You have to start it again then.
Okay. Let's just go to the same point, isn't it? So. Oh, I do it. What are we doing? Right, we're there, aren't we? Right, we seem to be on the move again.
You need to reshare it because we can't see it at the moment.
Okay. Ow. You still there?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you see anything yet?
No, no, no.
Oh dear. Right, I'm going there.
Yeah, something's happening. Yeah, okay. I can see my email.
Yes.
Right, there we are.
Right. Ah, come on. Okay. Right. Start again. I grow my oxalis in these 10 centimeter pots. Here they're just coming into growth. They're mesh pots, the sort of ones you use for pond culture, and they're sitting in a sort of sandy plunge, so the roots are moist through most of the year. They die down in autumn, and they're just coming into growth at the moment in this shot here. If they get dry in summer, they will die down and come back the following year. So this summer, in the very hot weather, many of them died down in midsummer and are now sort of back, and came back into growth, or will come back into growth in spring. I repot them in about February usually, repotting every couple of years. And laciniate is pretty easy. After a couple of years, you'll get lots and lots of rhizomes under the soil. In many instances, these will make their way to the surface, but when you repot them, I'd put them maybe 4 or 5 centimeters down. And in the wild, you'll find them even deeper, maybe 10 centimeters sometimes down under the surface. But for some reason, in culture, they'll make their way up to the surface. This is laciniate, fairly easy to propagate by breaking these sections of rhizome. And Adenophylla forms these bulb-like rhizomes, again, fairly easy to propagate by breaking the individual bulbs off. And they again will make their way to the surface in culture, but in wild they're centimeters down. And this is a hybrid between the two. And you can see the top bulb has been poking out of the grit and is photosynthesizing, but below the surface, you've got these little intermediates between laciniata and Adenophylla. If you want to grow them from seed, if you want to do it yourself rather than allow the bees to do it, then you need to cross-pollinate selected varieties. And like primulas, they go in for heterostyle, but whereas many primulas just have a single, have pin and thrum flowers, here there are 3 different forms, depending. Each flower has 2 sets of anthers and 1 set of stigmas, and so there's 3 possible combinations. So the top left one has anthers at the top, then stigmas, then anthers. The top right is anthers, sorry, stigma, anther, anther, and the bottom one is anthers, anther, and stigma at the bottom. And it's probably, you'll get a better seed set if you cross 2 of the different forms. And when you can see that right at the top of the picture there's a pod which is just set. You can see a bit of remains of the flower on top. And as soon as the pods begin to fill with seed, the pod heads down for ground level, and they're hidden under the leaves, probably to stop them being eaten by herbivores. But as soon as they begin to ripen, you can tell when they're ripe because they pop out at the top of the massive leaves, and you can see their pods that are just beginning to split. Don't wait till they're brown. There'll be no seeds left in them. They have explosive pods and seeds. And if you pick them at this stage gently, put them in a bag and squeeze the pods, the seeds will shoot out. And you can see there, what happens is the outer layer of cells around the seed splits explosively, the little white bits there, and the seeds then sort of dry off and become this sort of whitish color. And I would sow the seeds more or less immediately. You're getting your seeds in about July, August. So I would certainly sow them before September, October. The seed seems to go dormant very quickly, so it's probably better to sow them immediately. And they germinate the following March, April. And in this particular group of oxalis, the cotyledons stay beneath the ground, and the first leaves you get poking out the soil are true leaves. So they've got these little leaves with 3 or 4 leaflets on them. And so here we are in March, April. The top 2 images are Oxalis laciniata, and the bottom one is Oxalis adenophylla. At the end of the season, first growing season, if you empty out the pot, you'll find lots of little rhizomes, and these you can pot on to make individual plants. A few will flower the following year, but most will flower the year after. Right at the top there, at the top of the screen, you'll see a little white rhizome there. And it looks as though this is a hybrid. It was seed from a laciniata, but obviously adenophylla's got in. It's produced a little bulb type rhizome typical of adenophylla. So here we've got the laciniata rhizome to the left and adenophylla to the right. With some of the adenophylla seedlings, you'll see they develop this long, fat, contractile root, which will pull them down further into the compost. So it doesn't happen on all of them. I don't know why, but certainly in nature you'll find adenophylla bulbs rather way down in the under soil level. I've not mentioned Eniaphylla, very variable, one of the easiest to grow. The bottom right picture is from the steppe, where they tend to be large and vigorous. The top 2 pictures are from tops of mountains, and I find that the mountain forms more difficult to grow. Very variable in leaf, very variable in flower. There's a good proportion of white ones, but mainly pink on the mainland Argentina and Chile. In the Falklands, most of the plants are white. And there's an excellent introduction that Peter Erskine introduced from the Falklands called Sheffield Swan, which is in cultivation. These have a rhizome sort of midway between laciniata and adenophylla. And lauricata, just to show the variation, quite difficult. These have rhizomes a bit like laciniata, but much thicker. There are a few clones around, but not many. I would like to try and hybridize this with Adenophylla or Laciniata when I actually get them flowering together. Just a few more Oxalis in cultivation. Top left is Squamata. I introduced this to my garden years ago, and it's a bit of a weed now, especially in frames. It's easy to pull out, but it can seed everywhere. So it's a bit of a menace, but quite attractive. Compacta I've grown, very variable, and the forms I've had have had small flowers, very loose growing. The wonderfully named Oxalis Nahuel huapiensis forms cushions. It's a step plant, and Erythrorhiza, I think one or two people still have this. It's a high mountain plant that forms sort of soft cushions and does grow well in cultivation, but a bit looser than you see it in nature. Right, Calceolarias in their own family, Calceolariaceae, and a few species I'll look at. I've listed a few there that are in cultivation, and if you look around in various collections, you'll find maybe one or two other species. Seed of Calceolaria is tiny, and if you're sowing this, either sow it on the surface of the compost, or what I sometimes do is put a thin layer of grit on top of the compost, sprinkle the seed, and water it into the compost. Calceolaria is one of these plants where I would wait till spring, because all the seed germinates together. You want to sow it thinly. The big problem with this is if you sow it too thickly, the seeds will develop botrytis and you won't get many seedlings. But they're if you sow them in spring, they're not sitting about all winter, and they'll germinate very quickly, and that's by far the easiest way to grow them. And once they're big enough, you can put them on into individual pots. It's well worth collecting seed. Most will set seed without intervention, so you can just let them get on with it and collect the seed pods. Perhaps the most beautiful of the Calceolarias is Calceolaria uniflora, with its short-stemmed vertical flowers, and closely related is Calceolaria fothergillii from the Falkland Islands, and they're obviously closely related, and we'll see a hybrid between these two in a moment, which has been in cultivation for many years. Uniflora isn't the easiest of plants, I find. It's well worth collecting seed. It often goes down with greenfly or botrytis. It will grow okay in a raised bed in a rockery or in a trough, but I find it easier in pots, quite variable. And it's bird pollinated, pollinated by ground feeding birds. And these species, the least seed snipe has been filmed actually pollinating the flowers in nature. And what they do is to consume, if you look at the two flowers on the left, they consume the white bar, which is rich in sugar, and in so doing they get pollen deposited on their heads. So you can take a wonderful picture of a Calceolaria uniflora in the wild, and when you actually look at it, when you get back, you realize the flowers have all been partly eaten. A Calceolaria that grows with uniflora is Polyrhiza, very closely related. It is in cultivation, and it hybridizes in the wild when you find the two growing together. I've not seen hybrids in cultivation, but it might be worthwhile trying and seeing whether you can get some interesting color forms. This is a hybrid that's been around for many years, a hybrid between uniflora and the Falklands fothergillii. I don't think it's as attractive as uniflora. It's got longer stems, and I think it's a bit wishy-washy, but it's easier to grow and forms a large plant relatively quickly. Just a few more species that are in cultivation. Biflora is relatively easy. It's mountainside or steppe close to mountains. Borsinii and Pritchardii, both found on mountain slopes, and Valdiviana is a woodland plant. So there's a few different species around, but you really need to look for them. I grew this for many years, Filicolis. It likes dampish ground, but I grew it in a sand bed. There it's growing with mimulus. So you can see how damp the soil is. And these have sort of bubble-like flowers on very, very thin stems. And they look fantastic blowing about in the wind. And just to give one that is readily available from some of the nurseries is Integrifolia Kentish Hero. And here it's growing in the glasshouse at Harlow Carr. I've grown this outside. It lasts for me about a couple of years max outside. It's not very long lived for me. And just a few other coloured forms, species. Arachnoidea is a mountain species that likes dampish conditions. Poikilanthes is a fantastic species not in cultivation, which is a sort of snowmelt species. Alba, the white one, I think isn't quite hardy. It's from the Chilean side of the Andes, and Canna is a woodland species. Right, let's move on to Ourisia. And these are, they used to be in the Scrophulariaceae, they're now in the Plantagenaceae. There are 9 species in South America, and we also get species in New Zealand and 1 or 2 other places. 3 of the best of these are cliff dwellers, and the seed of them was introduced by Flores and Watson. I've not mentioned Flores, well, I did mention Brett at the start, but many of the Patagonian alpines we have in cultivation still originate from Flores and Watson's seed. And this is the case with Ourisia polyantha and Ourisia microphylla, both in cultivation. In the wild, their distributions don't overlap. They're from northern Patagonia and beyond with polyantha. And this is polyantha in the wild, growing on a cliff in the central Cordilleras, and they're hummingbird pollinated. They flower early in sort of summer, late spring, and they rely on the hummingbirds moving south as the weather warms. And they have large, long-tubed red flowers or orange flowers and produce copious nectar. Now, we got seed of this years ago from John Watson and Anita Flores. Most of the plants we got was like the top left one, sort of pale orangey, but we selected one good form, which we call Cliftonville Scarlet, which was a good red. And I think this is possibly the only cloning cultivation. And this is one of the problems when you select out good forms, you tend to ignore others and you lose the genetic diversity in cultivation, which you need to keep a species going in cultivation. But Cliftonville Scarlet was an excellent form and is still around and grows well. I grow them in a shallow pan, often standing in a little bit of water in a plant tray in summer. They don't like to dry out in summer and keep the compost just moist in winter. They don't mind really what compost you use within reason. I've grown them in almost pure sand, but they do a far better in a mix of about 50% JI, sand and leaf mold. This is the other species, Ourisia microphylla, and it grows on basalt or conglomerate cliffs. It's a fantastic species and has these little wiry stems with tiny leaves. And we got seed of this from John Watson and managed to get it into cultivation. And there's a couple of clones going around. In cultivation, it forms quite big cushions. I've had several sort of farrows with this and the white form of this. Some populations are white white flowered, and interestingly, the white flowered ones seem to be more vigorous than the pink ones. I'm not quite sure why. The seed of these is absolutely minute. The pods here are about 2 millimeters, and they will set seed by themselves, but you can cross-pollinate if you want to increase genetic diversity. And what I do with these to sow them, if you sow them directly in soil, you've got to sow them very thinly, otherwise you get botrytis problems. But in any case, they're very subject to botrytis. So what I do with them is to sow them in mini cloches in a mix of sand and fine pumice. And a bit like with ferns, I pour boiling water over the surface to sterilize the mix before sowing the seed on the surface. Sow the seeds very thinly, and the seeds, a bit like the calceolarias, the seed either germinates or it doesn't. It's no use waiting another year. It's all or none with these tiny seeds. And the seedlings germinate and grow very slowly over weeks, months, and eventually when they're about 1 centimeter high, I will gradually wean them from the high humidity. If you do it too quickly, they dry up or go down with botrytis very quickly. You need to expose them to a bit of low humidity air for 2 or 3 weeks before you put them on. And this is hopefully what you get. And you can get them to flower by the following year. For cuttings, this is a bit bizarre. If you try and put cuttings, you can take cuttings of non-flowering shoots of polyantha or microphylla at any time, preferably during the summer months. And if you put them under a cloche, the high humidity causes them to form roots from the nodes, and invariably the roots then develop botrytis. So the aerial roots. So the best way is to simply stand them in water. And this is a really simple technique. There's a plant saucer, the sort of thing you'd put under a pot, a tiny clay pot in the middle, and the rest is filled with Cornish grit. And I fill up the water every day or two, so it floods the tray, and the cuttings, you get 90+% take by just standing in water. And as soon as they begin to grow, you know they've got roots, and you can pot them on. You can put them in full sun whilst they're rooting, or in semi-shade, and it works very well. If you try to do it under cover, you get very low percent rooting. All Ourisias look messy after flowering, and they gradually, the stems die back. You see this in nature as well. And it's at this stage when you can collect seed pods, but don't be disheartened. Just, the stems are very brittle. You can break off the stems you don't want, and you get new shoots developing from the center. They've got a woody center. A few years ago, we decided to try and cross-pollinate the bird-pollinated polyantha and the insect-pollinated microphylla, and we ended up with a hybrid, or a number of hybrids that all look very similar. The distributions don't overlap in the wild, so it was unlikely that we were going to get any offspring, but we got lots, and we continued with this for several generations, gradually getting more and more color into the mix. And we showed them, and it went reasonably well at shows. Some people commented they looked like Winterbox plants, but who cares? I think they were pretty good, I think. And I don't grow them now, but this is what my Ourisia house used to look like in summer, with lots of them in flower, massive amount of color. So these are hybrids. Right, let's move on to Solanaceae, Benthiumellas and Fabianas and Petunias. And these top 5 Benthiamellas are all in cultivation, and the Fabiana and Petunia patagonica. So we'll look at these. These like a gritty mix, and I tend to grow them in fairly deep pots. Benthiamella patagonica is perhaps the most successful of the species. There's been a whole number of former species which have been pushed into Benthiamella patagonica. I'm not totally convinced that there should be a single species because they grow in different habitats. Some are in mountains, some are in open steppe. For some people, these grow really well and they form very good cushions, tight, hard cushions, but they don't always flower easily. Some people can flower them really well. I've flowered them before quite well and shown them, but the characteristic of Patagonica, Benthiamella patagonica, is that they have these, if you look at the bottom right one, they've got these blunt leaves with a little patch of hair on the end of the leaves. What I haven't seen is people trying to hybridize between the few clones we have in cultivation. And I think it would be well worth trying to cross it's not really hybridizing because it's within the same species allegedly, but we need to generate more clones. I think the best one at the moment is the white one, which we find in the top left one, which we find in the extreme south. Benthiamella longifolia is in cultivation, but I've never seen this many flowers on one in cultivation. I've had a few flowers, but not this many. It's a high mountain plant, and whereas Patagonica, some forms are in the mountains, some are on the steppe, so you've got a bit more chance that they would be successful. Northern Sheldii also in cultivation, but you're lucky if you get 2 or 3 flowers on this in cultivation. It's again a high mountain plant forming these tight mats, but a beautiful little plant species. Benthiamella azarella is in cultivation, very slow growing. This is about maybe 30 centimeters across, grows in the steppe and into the mountains. And here's one I grew to about 8-9 centimeters, took about 10 plus years to get to that size. And the flowers are minute, but it's a pretty little thing. And the trick with this is not letting it dry out in summer. I think you've got to keep it fairly, not dripping wet, but moist. And a Benthiamella, all the other Benthiamellas are from the far south, but this one is from the northern Patagonia and has the glandular hairs along the side of the flowers. You can get this into a sizable cushion, but in nature and in cultivation, you seem to get plants that flower well, then die after flowering, and others that continue to grow. And you find this in the wild also. Some just go brown after flowering. And a few more Benthiamellas not in cultivation, but should be. Scotsburgii, which has a very limited distribution in the southern steppe. Pycnophyloides, which is found on escarpments, and Spegatsiniana on hills to the east of the Andes, and Lanata, which is a steppe plant. None of them in cultivation. Just move on to Fabiana, another Solanaceae. Fabiana imbricata you can get from some nurseries in the UK, and it can get up to 1 meter or 2 in height. There are prostrate forms. Flowers are tubular, blue to whitish. I've got a fairly compact form that's only about 40 or 50 centimeters across, and is prostrate. But tubular white, bluish lilac flowers and tiny leaves. Fabiana nana, I don't know if this is still in cultivation. It's very slow growing. It's a steppe plant, and you can get big cushions up to maybe 50 centimeters or more across. But in cultivation, it's really slow growing and flowers not as well as this. It produces leaves in spring and then sheds its leaves, so it's relying on its stems for photosynthesis. The one that is still around and grows fairly reliable is Fabiana foliosa. And we got seed years ago from John Watson, and there was quite a range of forms, and from prostrate to upright, and this is a form we selected with sort of pale greeny yellow flowers, and this is still around. It makes a nice plant and has won a Farah a couple of times, I think, in the past. Petunia patagonica is a fantastic plant and one of my favorites. It grows in steppe at about 800 meters and then up into some of the drier mountains. And this is a large old plant. Don't think it's going to flower in that particular year. They don't flower every year in the wild. The ones lower down on the steppe seem to flower every year and grow much more rapidly. These plants have extensive root systems, and that often prove difficult to flower in cultivation. The best ones I have are ones that have rooted into the plunge and have roots maybe 2 or 3 feet away from the pot, and they then flower reasonably well. They will flower outside. They do very well with them at Kew, and it's not too difficult. So here's one growing in the wild. It's very variable in flower, absolutely beautiful. And there's a nice pot full. Many of them, when they first open, the first day, the flowers are beautiful, deep colored, and then over successive days they become paler, and the petals flex back and forth every day. This is one growing in a covered rockery in one of my frames. If you want to get seed from these and the Fabianas, they're not self-fertile. You need to cross 2 varieties. Unfortunately, we only have one Fabiana foliosa cloning cultivation, so we have to rely on cuttings, and cuttings are fairly easy from Fabiana and Petunia. So this are seed pods by crossing two Petunia clones, and they produce masses of seeds. They set seed fairly easily. A few years ago, someone did a bit of research and compared Petunia patagonica with all the other Petunia species in South America, and decided that they're nothing like any other Petunia species. You might have guessed. And looking at the DNA, they're far closer to Fabiana. They really ought to be moved into a separate genus or moved into Fabiana. After I read this paper, I had Fabiana foliosa and Petunia patagonica in flower, and so I crossed them both ways. The Fabiana didn't set any seed, but the Petunia did, and I got a whole lot of hybrids between them. Only one has flowered so far, but what I was hoping for is a plant that flowered with a profusion of the Fabiana reliably every year, with a color range of Petunia. So far, I've only got plants that flower fairly badly, but not bad colored. So, well, things are well worth hybridizing. We looked at a few Junellias now within the Verbinaceae, and quite a few are in cultivation. They don't all flower fantastically, but in nature, they're wonderful. So this is Junellia patagonica in the far south, and it forms these really hard cushions on the steppe with a ring of flowers around the outside that often turn pink as they get pollinated. Very slow growing. Here's one I grew a few years ago. It went to a few plant shows, very strongly scented, and they need a deepish pot with a sandy open compost. But I didn't find them too difficult. Related is Junellia coralloides, which we described, and this is a plant from a bit further north, very dry steppe, and has these bizarre coralloid growths in nature, and some of these you'd think were dead until you see little bunches of flowers appearing from the ends of the stems. And here it is in cultivation. Flowers are generally white or pale yellow, but it's a super plant, and I can't propagate it by cuttings, but they can at Aberconwy. So here's a couple of nice looking plants of coralloides. Now, to pollinate, it's quite difficult. They have long tubes. If you just leave them to the passing bees and so on, you won't get any seed. So I use a coarse paintbrush hair to push down the tubes and transfer pollen between different clones. They're not self-fertile. And you can see just about on this here, there's a pod which has set seed, and in each seed you'll get in each pod you'll get 4 long seeds max, and so if you transfer pollen enough, you end up with quite a few seed, and there's 2 or 3 people doing this now. So this is wonderful. We're getting the plant with a bit more genetic diversity. Junellia micrantha has been around for some years now, originally as Junellia wilczekii, and one of the European nurseries has different colour forms of this, one labelled micrantha and one labelled wilczekii, but they're all the same thing. They grow in areas that are flooded in as the snow melts in spring, generally on the steppe, drier areas, sometimes into the mountains. So different colour forms, easy, you can grow it outside in troughs. The flowers are tiny, and don't be concerned if the leaves turn brown or black in winter, because they regenerate from buds in spring. Junellia azarelloides can be pink or white. In its best forms, it forms tight mats, but as with a lot of these Junellias, they can have upright growth forms as well as mat forms. So azarelloides, I think, is in cultivation, but it's been confused with a couple of other species, including Junellia o'Donnellii, which has little pointed leaves. And this, I think, it is certainly in cultivation. Junellia erinacea just gets into northern Patagonia, but it's really a species from further north in Mendoza, and it can be bluish or white. And years ago, I got seed of this from John Watson, and it would never flower for me. And eventually, I just ignored it, and it rooted into the plunge, and became one of these plants you can never remove from your greenhouse because it's well and truly rooted in. And I passed on cuttings of this to Aberconwy, and I think they still have it, but very strongly scented, very spiny. One of my favorites is one of the few mountain Junellias, because many of the Junellias grow in dry steppe. This is Junellia congesta, which we know from only one site, Monte Zabajas in northern Santa Cruz province, and it's a fantastic plant. It flowers as the snow melts in spring, and is usually has these wonderful pink buds open to whitish flowers, and there's a white form there that we found, but a couple of clones of this are in cultivation. I've never seen it flowered very well. I've had the occasional flower, but it seems what it needs is cold summers, and certainly I can't do cold summers anymore. I don't know if any of you can. And this is one I would like to get into cultivation. It's a dry steppe Junellia we found with bright yellow flowers, or orangey yellow. And this isn't in cultivation, but it should be. Right, just to finish, we'll look at some of the monocots. And Alströmerias, rhodophialas, and Famatina. Alströmerias to start with, and these aren't too difficult. I used to grow lots of species, and I used to grow them in deep pots in an access frame, sunk in a sandy plunge, and providing the Most of the species I grew were hardy, but some were slightly tender, and providing the roots were down under the plunge level, they would survive the winter. Now, all the Patagonian Chilean species are summer dormant, and when we first got a lot of these seeds in from John Watson and Anita Flores back in the 90s and 2000s, many growers found them difficult. And I would talk to some of these people at the shows, and it seemed what they were doing with putting their pots in the garage for winter, drying them off, and when in fact they should have been growing in winter, and maybe putting them in the garage in summer. So most of them are summer dormant. So they die down after flowering. Sometimes the leaves die down before flowering, and the leaves reappear in August, September. They have seeds that are like little hard shot. You can sand the seeds or chip them slightly before you sow them. But if you've got relatively fresh seed, you can sow them straight away. I like sowing them way down. So if I'm sowing them in the rockery, I'll dig a hole maybe 2 or 3 inches deep and drop the seed in and then cover them up. If you put them too close to the surface, the seed washes out very easily. So it's a good way to get things, get Alcinaria established in a rockery, get them deep, is to push them way down, and they'll come through fairly easily. If you've got old seed, you might want to try rubbing them with sandpaper. The oldest seed I've got to germinate was about 15 years old. So the old seed is well worth trying, but it might take a while. The seed pods are explosive, so the seed is shot everywhere. And I have frames where 2 or 3 different species have taken up permanent residence. They have tubers. The pot on the right as the plants are more or less got rid of the soil. They're just filled the pot with tubers. If tubers break off, don't try and plant them. They need the eye at the top of the stem, little stem there you can see on the left. And different species have different shaped tubers. But they're relatively easy from seed, and some will flower in their second year, and most will flower in their second or third year. But you need to keep potting them on. We all know Alstroemeria Aurea, which has been in cultivation for years. I remember when I was a kid, these were in gardens, and they can become a bit of a menace. They have stolons and can be very, very weedy. But in the area where they succeed in Chile, they're growing in woodland, a bit like bluebells. So they have an orange carpet instead of blue, and quite variable. But some people try and grow them in rockeries, and they are at Kew, growing in the South American bed. They're not rockery plants, they should be in woodland. Another woodland species, Alstroemeria presleyiana, grows in woodland margins or in open woodland. And we find it in northern Patagonia, in Argentina and Chile. And it's a nice pink or pinkish flower. Leaves are beginning to die down before flowering. Here again, good woodland plant growing in the South American bed at Kew, doing very well. I can't grow this species, but quite a few people do grow it. One of my favorite Alstroemerias is pallida, growing high up in here, central Chile. And they've got these beautiful, very variable flowers with a yellow band across the top of the upper petals. And the leaves have more or less died down, and we'd get the flower shoots popping out. Quite variable, right down on the ground. And I've grown this and flowered it. It's quite an easy species. Exerens is similar to pallida, but it grows slightly higher up. And again, not too difficult. Umbellata is one of my favorites, and it grows in screes where water continues to run through from snowmelt. So in this species, the leaves don't die down till later in summer because they have a ready supply of moisture. So they continue in leaf building up their their tubers. They have beautiful rounded flowers. I've grown this, but it never looks the same. It never forms that nice rosette. It's much looser grain, more difficult. And similarly, Spaciolata, which in nature has these nice rosettes of fleshy leaves. And there's my attempt, bottom right. Not quite as good. Now, this is a plant which we find quite widely in southern Patagonia, and it's a fantastic plant. Until a couple of years ago, we called this Alstroemeria patagonica. And I always was a little bit worried because the plants we have in cultivation don't look anything like this. I couldn't really work out what we had in cultivation. So bottom right is what we see in cultivation. And I thought maybe this was another yellow species that we get in northern Argentina and Peru called Alstroemeria pygmaea. But a couple of years ago, somebody looked at these two species in detail and decided what we thought was Patagonica was a new species, and they described it as Alstroemeria isteparica. And I'm not sure this is in cultivation. We just have this small flowered squinny thing. And I looked through all my images I've got from all over Patagonia, and I only found a few from southern Chile that I could identify as Alstroemeria patagonica with these radially symmetrical flowers. It might be because where I'd seen them growing elsewhere, I might have looked at them and thought, God, these are not worth photographing. They're not very attractive compared with. So I would really like to get Alstroemeria esteparica into cultivation. Alstroemerias that are in cultivation, hookeri, it's a nice dark form there, growing in a frame amongst through Junellia micrantha. And there's a pharamedal one, a very pale form, and easy plants, seeds around, and quickly bulks up. And other species that are growable, Garaventi, versicolor, Alstroemeria diluta, and Kingia, they're all available from some seed sources, but they tend to grow slightly taller in cultivation than you see them in nature. Right, let's look at some of the amaryllids. And there's a large number of species. Some of them have been lumped together in recent years, and most of the rhodophialas have now been pushed into another genus, Zephyranthes, and a few into Rhodolirion. I'll go through these. These are bifida, which are not Patagonian. They're from northern Argentina, but just to show you what the bulbs are like. These are quite small bulbs. Some of the ones we've seen in from species in southern Patagonia can be the size of medium to large onions and very, very deep. So they need, if you're growing them, they need to be in deep pots or planted very deep. My problem with these, I've flowered a few of them, but narcissus fly is a big problem in my garden. And if I don't watch it, eventually I lose them to narcissus fly. They all form these large three-lobed seed pods, and they produce black papery seeds. And very much like other like fritillarias that produce this sort of seed, they're best sown on the surface of the compost and maybe just weighed down with a tiny amount of grit. You don't want to bury these. And they germinate very well. They're wind dispersed, which is why they succeed in sort of colonizing mountain habitats after volcanic eruptions and so on. So this is Famatina, which is closely related to Rhodophiala. It's an hummingbird pollinated species. It will die down in late spring and set seed, and it's down for the summer. And many of the other Rhodophialas die down over summer. I've got this one growing, but I've never flowered it. But it's got beautiful waxy red flowers. Rhodophiala montana from northern Patagonia usually flowers with its leaves, and the leaves die down later. Rhodofiala, this is now Rhodolirion andicola, single flowers, pink flowers, growing in the mountains on rocky substrates and volcanic. I've grown this and flowered it. It takes several years to flower, 4, 5, 6 years. And again, very susceptible to narcissus fly. Here it's growing on the side of a volcano in Chile, growing just through volcanic cinder. And another high mountain, Rhodolirion, montanum, or Rhodofiala rhodolirion, depending on who you believe. Very variable, absolutely beautiful. You can see the leaves have died down completely. We're just getting the flower buds pushing up through. I've grown this once. I've not managed to flower it, but it's a beautiful, really beautiful flower. Quite variable. This is a very robust steppe species we find in northern. It grows in the area where the monkey puzzles grow, the Araucania, on both sides of the Andes. And in 2017, we found a plant with about 50 flower stems, huge bulbs, and always flowers with its leaves. And the leaves let you know what direction the wind's blowing. And another plant this time growing in sparse open woodland, very variable, Rhodofiala advena. If you want to look for more detail on how these grow, look at the Pacific Bulb Society, which outlines, so they've got some of the species right, but it outlines sometimes how to grow these, but they generally need deep, well-drained composts. And just a couple more, Rhodofiala elwesii, with a very limited distribution on the steppe. And this beautiful little thing that just pushes up in spring on the steppe with these yellowish greenish flowers, Rhodofiala mendocina. Again, with enormous bulbs way down, but very deep. And let's look at a few frustrating plants. Well, you might say they're all frustrating, but Oreoplis glacialis is locally known as the tortilla. It grows anywhere from steppe to high mountains, from southern Patagonia to the far north. You'd think with a plant with so many environmental tolerances, it would be easy in cultivation, and I've never seen it grown or shown. I've grown it with 2 or 3 flowers, but despite the fact that we've had seed introduced many times, we never get the damn thing like this. So tortilla or omelette. Yes, the violas, I guess you'd call frustrating. Top left is Viola coronifera, top right Viola dasyphila, bottom left Viola petrea and Viola succulus, the white one. All difficult. A few have been flowered, but they still remain. You can grow them for a few years. If you're lucky, you'll get a flower or 2, but very rarely does anyone succeed with these, unfortunately. And just a few other things in cultivation. Tristagmas, these are in the, well, they were in the onion family. I think they've been moved into the amarylid family. This has been around for many years from northern Chile. There's a whole complex of Patagonicums. They have little bulbs and relatively easy to grow. Tristagma nivale, I grow these in pots. Wonderful coloured flowers, very strongly scented at night, obviously aiming for night pollinators. These are growing mountainsides and steppe. Sorry, a friend of mine in Patagonia sent me this image of Tristagma nivale. They dig them, collect the bulbs and use them as sort of cocktail onions. So very strong onion flavour. And cacti, one time we tended to ignore cacti in the Alpine Garden Society, but thankfully this has been remedied. This is a steppe cactus, Junellia chubatensis from Patagonia. Many species, some recently described, of terra cactus, and these are not too difficult to grow in typical cactus conditions, perhaps keeping them, some of the southern ones, slightly moist in winter rather than drying them out completely. Maihuenia poepicii in the bottom left gets up to about 2,000 meters, forms large mats with yellow flowers. This grows well for me, but I very rarely get flowers. And on the steppe, you get the white or pink Maihuenia patagonica. And then Maihueniopsis with lethal spines, barbed spines. You really don't want to get those in your fingers, but they're growable. And the ostracactus are at the moment being revised, new species, and there are quite a few, again, growable. They need cooler conditions in summer to grow well, but absolutely beautiful flowers. Just a few odd things just to finish with. Terrassa humilis in the Malvaceae grow quite well. This is one of the few plants that looks better in cultivation than it does in the wild, more flowers. And Neobaclia has been shown and flowered. I don't grow it now, but it has these fantastic, it's in the Malvaceae, it's a mallow, these fantastic blue flowers and very rarely white flowers. And this is something I really wanted to grow for years, and I managed to grow one quite a few years ago, and this one here, and it can have white or pink flowers. It's related to things like Lewisias and this is Calandrinia affinis. Beautiful plant, grows in ground which is moist in spring. So it's very difficult getting the balance right between moist and dry, because at certain times of the year it wants to be fairly dry. And Cicyrhynchiums, this is from central to northern Chile, Macrocarpum, seeds about in the garden in rockery. Here it's growing with Oxalis, the little Oxalis, the pink one at the back, Spaciolata, and a hybrid Oxalis Adenophylla laciniata. But there is a clone of Nasavia lagaski in cultivation you can get from Aberconway, but we don't have the large-headed forms we see on the top right. These are in the Compositae family. They're growable and they're absolutely beautiful. They'd be white or pink. And just a few tropiolums. Brachyceras I had for a few years. Here growing through Junellia micrantha. And incisum, I still have a plant of incisum. Some people find this really difficult. Others say it's a bit of a weed in their gardens, but I'd like it to be a weed in mine. It grows in a dry frame for me. And just to finish, some of the stinging plants, Chiophora coronata, I find relatively easy. It's in the family Loaceae. It has stinging hairs. I've shown it a few times at AGS shows. It's a high mountain plant. It's not too difficult to grow, but it isn't perennial for me. It lasts a couple of years until it flowers and then dies. But in nature, it comes back again, goes through several years. It's pollinated by rodents, produces copious nectar. And the other one, Loasa sigmoidea, is one I got as seed as Loasa nana, which is a really choice plant. This isn't bad, but it's much looser than Loasa nana. And so just to finish, although we think southern Patagonian plants are few and far between in cultivation, they are around, and all of these here have had Farrer medals in the past. Okay, thank you very much. Finally got through the talk.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. It was fascinating, of course, and I'm left with that image of your greenhouse full of Ourisia hybrids. What happened to them? Why did you stop growing them? They were really nice.
It was just a lot of effort. It was a lot of effort keeping them going, and I sort of moved on to something else. But I made sure that most of the clones were at Aberconwy Nursery, so they still have some of them.
Good, good. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to either use the chat option or to unmute yourselves and fire away.
Shall I stop sharing or not?
You can if you want, yes.
Okay. Right, any questions?
Yes, Martin, I've got a question about Oreopolis gracialis, which you have managed to grow. What kind of compost would you grow? What kind of a regime for growing it would you use?
I think the last time I tried it, I managed to get, I used a mix of sand, grit and leaf mold and didn't bother with any JI. Pardon? You there?
No, that was just an interruption.
Okay, a mix of leaf mold, grit and sand in more or less equal parts. And I got a plant which was looking very promising to about 10 centimeters across. It looked the best I've ever grown one. And then I got COVID and was in hospital for 3 months and it dried up.
What a shame, what a shame. So what kind of watering regime would you recommend?
I would, it's difficult. I would be watering every few days in summer, maybe every 3 or 4 days. It depends on what your compost is like. I had it plunged in sand. In winter, maybe watering every 3 weeks, you know, that sort of amount, you know, and watering into the, either if their roots are through, watering into the plunge or watering around the edges of pots.
Great, well, thank you very much. I just have to get them to germinate now.
Yeah, did you get some seed from, what's his name? I've forgotten who was,
Jeff.
Jeff, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff has been bringing them in there. It's quite variable in that where Jeff is getting them from is his son lives in central Patagonia and he's getting plants that are growing on the steppe. As you move further north, the plants aren't quite as attractive. They're looser cushions and the flowers don't cover the cushion, but where he's getting them, they should be good.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yes.
I'll let you know how I go on.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Magnificent lecture, Martin. Thank you very much.
We're sorry for the breaks.
Well, it's worth every second.
Yes, many thanks also and positive feedback on the chat window. I want to read them all. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Martin, I grow Alceraria hookeri and I find it flowers better when it's young rather than when it's established. That's perhaps because I don't pot it up often enough, but I'm never quite sure how much water to give it in the summer. Is it totally dormant in the summer?
Yeah, I mean, you'll give it a little bit of water. I've got it growing now. I don't grow it in pots anymore. I've got it self-seeded in a frame which is more or less completely covered in summer, so it gets a little bit of water seeping in from the outside. And I've got some that I've pushed into crevices in a rockery, pushed the seed in, and they flowered last year. So I'm not growing it in pots anymore, but it's some people complain that it becomes a weed in frames because it seeds around so much. If you like weeds like that.
Yeah, well, it's quite nice, but yes, it does shoot its seeds out all over the place.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Well, if no one else has any questions, I want to thank you all for your patience and for attending tonight's meeting. Next month in November, we have Dr. John Grimshaw talking about alpines from the African mountains. So make sure to join us next time as well. Thank you, Martin, once again, and I'm wishing you all a lovely evening. Bye for now.
Right.
Thank you, Martin. See you soon.
Yes, hopefully.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.